Marcus Chen sat frozen in his Tesla, watching through tinted windows as his warehouse supervisor, James Martinez, limped toward a battered Honda Civic at 11 p.m. The parking lot was nearly empty now, just a few scattered vehicles under flickering fluorescent lights that cast long shadows across the cracked asphalt. Marcus had built a $47 million logistics empire from nothing, starting with a single delivery truck 12 years ago, but tonight something gnawed at him with an intensity he couldn't ignore. For 3 weeks, James had been requesting double shifts, arriving 2 hours early, and Marcus had caught him sleeping in his office twice, slumped over paperwork with dark circles under his eyes that looked like bruises. The other executives whispered about firing him for declining performance during their Monday meeting. He's making mistakes on inventory reports, his CFO had said coldly. His team morale is down. He's not the James we knew. But Marcus had built his success on reading people, on trusting his instincts about character, and those instincts were screaming that something was desperately wrong. James Martinez wasn't just any employee. He was the man who had stayed until 3 a.m. 8 years ago when a computer system crash threatened to lose them their biggest contract. He was the supervisor whose team had the lowest turnover rate in the entire company because he knew every worker's name, their kids' names, their dreams. Marcus had attended James's wife's funeral 2 years ago, had seen the devastation in his eyes as he stood beside that casket with a 5-year-old girl clinging to his leg. So instead of going home to his penthouse overlooking the city, Marcus made a decision that would change everything. He started his engine and followed the Honda Civic, maintaining a careful distance as they pulled out of the industrial complex. His hands gripped the steering wheel tighter than necessary, and he could feel his heart hammering against his ribs. He told himself he was being ridiculous, invasive even, but he couldn't stop. Something about James's haunted expression as he'd walked to his car had triggered every protective instinct Marcus possessed. He followed the Honda through rain-slick streets, the windshield wipers keeping rhythm with his racing thoughts. They passed through neighborhoods that grew progressively quieter, past closed storefronts and empty playgrounds where swings moved gently in the wind. Marcus stayed 3 cars back, feeling like a character in a detective movie, except this wasn't entertainment. This was real life, and the man he was following was someone he genuinely cared about, even if he'd never quite articulated that sentiment during their professional interactions. His chest tightened as the Honda pulled into Sacred Heart Hospital's emergency entrance, the Red Cross illuminated against the dark sky like a beacon. Marcus felt his stomach drop. Hospital. Of course it was a hospital. But James didn't go inside immediately. Instead, he sat in his car in the parking space, and Marcus pulled into a spot 4 rows back where he could still see clearly. For 20 long minutes, James just sat there, his silhouette visible through the rear window, and Marcus watched as his employee's shoulders began to shake with what could only be sobs. The sight of this strong, capable man breaking down alone in a hospital parking lot was almost more than Marcus could bear. When James finally emerged from his vehicle, his movements were those of someone carrying an unbearable weight. He wiped his face with both hands, straightened his shoulders in what looked like a physical effort to pull himself together, and walked toward the entrance with the determined gait of someone facing a battlefield. Marcus waited 5 agonizing minutes, his mind racing through possibilities, each one worse than the last. Then he followed, his expensive Italian shoes clicking against the hospital's linoleum floors, so out of place in this world of suffering and resilience. The emergency room was surprisingly quiet for a Tuesday night. A janitor mopped the far corner. An elderly couple sat holding hands in the waiting area. Marcus approached the reception desk, his mouth dry, and told the tired receptionist he was looking for the cafeteria, but his eyes were tracking James's retreating figure disappearing down a corridor marked with colorful painted handprints and cartoon characters. The pediatric wing. Marcus's blood ran cold, and suddenly he understood with terrible clarity that this wasn't about James at all. He stood there paralyzed for a moment, then approached the nurse's station in the pediatric oncology wing. A nurse with silver-streaked hair pulled back in a practical bun looked up from her computer screen. Her eyes were kind but exhausted, the eyes of someone who had seen too much suffering but refused to let it harden her heart. Marcus's voice came out rougher than intended. "I'm looking for James Martinez. I'm his employer. I need to know what's happening." The nurse studied him for a long moment, and Marcus saw her making calculations behind those tired eyes, weighing privacy against intuition. Something in his face must have convinced her of his sincerity because her expression softened. "You must be here about Sophia," she said quietly, glancing down the hallway. "Room 304. That little girl is a fighter, one of the bravest souls I've ever met in 20 years of pediatric nursing. But the experimental treatment she needs isn't covered by insurance. The pharmaceutical company charges $18,000 per round, and she needs 6 rounds minimum. Her father works himself to exhaustion trying to pay for it. We've caught him picking up extra janitorial shifts here at the hospital after his regular job, cleaning rooms from midnight to 4 a.m., then going straight back to work for you." The words hit Marcus like physical blows. $18,000 per round. 6 rounds minimum. That was over $100,000, and James made $52,000 a year as a warehouse supervisor. The math was impossible, brutally impossible, and suddenly every strange behavior of the past 3 weeks made perfect, heartbreaking sense. The double shifts weren't about ambition or work ethic failing. They were about a father trying to save his daughter's life through sheer force of will and extra hours. The sleeping at his desk wasn't laziness. It was exhaustion from working nearly around the clock. The mistakes on reports weren't incompetence. They were the inevitable result of a man running on fumes and desperation. Marcus felt his throat constrict, felt tears burning behind his eyes in a way they hadn't since he was a child. He had built an empire, had money in accounts he didn't even think about, owned 3 properties and a collection of cars, and here was a good man, a loyal man, literally working himself to death trying to save his daughter while too proud or too scared to ask for help. The injustice of it burned through Marcus's chest like acid. Marcus found the room but couldn't make himself enter, his hand frozen inches from the door handle. His legs felt weak, and he leaned against the wall beside room 304, trying to steady his breathing. Through the window, he saw James sitting beside a small bed, his large, work-worn hands gently holding the tiny hand of a bald 7-year-old girl whose smile somehow lit up the sterile room despite the tubes and monitors surrounding her like electronic sentinels. Sophia. The name the nurse had spoken now had a face, and that face was simultaneously heartbreaking and beautiful. Her skin had the translucent quality that came from months of chemotherapy, and dark circles rimmed her eyes, but when she looked at her father, her entire being radiated pure love and trust. James was reading to her from a worn copy of Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, doing silly voices that made her giggle weakly, the sound barely audible through the glass but precious beyond measure. He became Willy Wonka with an exaggerated accent, then Augustus Gloop with puffed-out cheeks, and each character transformation brought another small laugh from Sophia. Marcus watched this private moment of joy carved out from overwhelming darkness, and something fundamental shifted inside his chest. He had spent 12 years building a business empire, measuring success in profit margins and market share, but he had never witnessed anything as valuable as what he was seeing right now. A father loving his daughter through the worst nightmare any parent could face. On the windowsill sat a photograph in a simple frame, and Marcus moved closer to see it clearly. James, younger and fuller in the face, stood beside a beautiful woman with warm brown eyes and Sophia's same smile. The woman, James's late wife Maria, held a healthy toddler Sophia with a full head of dark curls, all 3 of them laughing at some moment of happiness that the camera had frozen in time. Marcus remembered the funeral 2 years ago, remembered James's eulogy where he'd talked about Maria's strength during her own battle with cancer, how she'd made him promise to always find joy in the small moments with Sophia, to never let fear steal their happiness. And now Sophia was fighting the same disease that had taken her mother, and James was facing this horror alone. Marcus pulled out his phone with trembling hands, his vision blurred with tears he no longer tried to hold back. He stepped away from the window and called his lawyer, not caring that it was nearly midnight. David answered on the 3rd ring, his voice groggy. "Marcus. What's wrong? Is everything okay?" Marcus's voice came out rough and urgent. "I need you to set up something immediately, tonight if possible. I need a medical grant program established under the company, fully funded, no bureaucratic delays. First recipient is James Martinez, and I need his daughter's entire treatment covered at Sacred Heart Hospital. Every penny. Contact the hospital's billing department first thing in the morning, get the total amount needed, and make sure they know the payment is guaranteed. I want this handled before James goes to work tomorrow." David was suddenly alert, all business. "How much are we talking about?" Marcus looked back through the window at Sophia, at James adjusting her blankets with infinite gentleness. "I don't care. Whatever it costs. And set up an ongoing fund with $2 million initial capital. I want this to help other families too. Call it the Martinez Family Medical Fund. Get the paperwork done tonight, David. I'll sign whatever you need in the morning, but I want that hospital to know before dawn that Sophia's treatment is covered." There was a pause, then David's voice came back softer. "You're a good man, Marcus. I'll have everything ready by 7 a.m. Marcus watched through the window as James gently kissed his daughter's forehead, and she drifted to sleep with a peaceful expression that seemed impossible given the circumstances. Then James slumped in his chair beside her bed, and Marcus saw the exact moment when the brave face crumbled. James buried his face in his hands, his entire body shaking with silent sobs, trying desperately not to wake Sophia. He was utterly defeated, completely broken, and Marcus had to turn away because the raw pain was too intimate, too devastating to witness. This man had given everything, work himself beyond any reasonable limit, and still faced the crushing reality that it might not be enough to save his little girl. Marcus didn't sleep that night. He went to his office at 4 a.m. and waited for David's email with the paperwork. He signed everything, contacted the hospital administrator personally, and made sure every detail was handled. At 8 a.m., he called James into his office, his heart pounding so hard he thought it might break through his ribs. He had rehearsed what to say a dozen times, but every version felt inadequate for the magnitude of what he needed to communicate. James arrived at 8:15, terrified, his face grey with exhaustion and dread. He probably hadn't slept at all. Marcus could see him bracing for termination, for the loss of the job that represented his daughter's only hope. The resignation in James's eyes was almost unbearable. Marcus gestured to the chair across from his desk, but his carefully rehearsed speech evaporated. Instead, he stood up and moved around the desk, unable to maintain that barrier of professional distance. He picked up an envelope from his desk, thick with documents, and held it for a moment, feeling its weight. "James," Marcus began, his voice thick with emotion he didn't try to hide. "I followed you last night. I know about Sophia. I know about everything." James's face went white, then red with shame. He opened his mouth to speak, probably to apologize or explain, but Marcus held up his hand. "Let me finish. Your daughter's treatment is covered, all of it, every single round of the experimental therapy, every scan, every medication, every hospital stay. It's done. Through the company's new medical grant program, you just became the first recipient of what's going to help a lot of families facing impossible choices." Marcus slid the envelope across his desk, and James took it with shaking hands. "And you're getting a raise, $25,000 a year, retroactive 6 months to cover what you've already spent. There's also a check in there for $50,000 to handle any other expenses, to give you breathing room. You should have told me, James. You should have let me help sooner." James opened the envelope with trembling fingers, saw the hospital payment confirmation letter, the grant approval, the check, and something broke inside him. He collapsed into sobs, deep wrenching sounds that came from a place of relief so profound it was almost painful to hear. "I was ashamed," James whispered between gasps for air. "Maria made me promise to take care of Sophia, and I thought asking for help meant I was failing her. I thought I could handle it alone, that I had to handle it alone. I didn't want charity. I didn't want pity. I just wanted to save my little girl." Marcus came around the desk and did something he'd never done with an employee before. He embraced James, let him sob into his shoulder, let him release the unbearable weight he'd been carrying alone. "The only failure would have been me not knowing," Marcus said quietly. "Sophia needs her father alive and present, not worked to death in hospital janitorial closets. You've given me 8 years of loyalty, of dedication, of making this company better. Let me give you this. Let me help save your daughter. That's not charity, James. That's what people who care about each other do." That experimental treatment worked beyond anyone's expectations. 3 years later, Sophia stood on a stage at the Riverside Convention Center, now 10 years old with beautiful dark hair down to her shoulders, her face full of color and life and possibility. She was giving the opening speech at the inaugural gala for the Martinez Family Medical Fund, which had grown to help 127 other families facing impossible choices between financial ruin and watching their children die. Her voice was clear and strong as she talked about her father's love, about the miracle of a boss who cared enough to follow an employee and discover the truth. Marcus stood in the back of the ballroom, watching James hold his healthy daughter's hand, both of them glowing with pride and gratitude. Tears streamed down Marcus's face, and he didn't bother wiping them away. Around him, other families whose children had been saved by the fund embraced each other. On the stage, photographs cycled through of smiling children in remission, of families given hope when they had none. The fund had grown to $8 million through donations and fundraising, touching lives across the entire region. James caught Marcus's eye from across the room and mouthed 2 words, "Thank you." Marcus shook his head and mouthed back, "Thank you." Because the truth was, James had given him something far more valuable than 8 years of excellent work. He had shown him what true wealth meant. Not the numbers in bank accounts or the properties owned or the cars in the garage. Real wealth was measured in lives saved, in children who got to grow up, in fathers who didn't have to carry unbearable burdens alone, in communities that chose to care for each other. Marcus had thought he was successful before that night in the hospital parking lot, but he'd been measuring the wrong things. Now, Watching Sophia laugh with her father, watching family celebrate second chances and new beginnings, Marcus finally understood what it meant to be truly rich. And it had nothing to do with the $47 million empire he'd built, and everything to do with the moment he chose to follow his heart instead of his business instincts, the moment he chose connection over indifference. That choice had saved Sophia's life, but in a very real way, it had saved his too.